Due to the nature of the contrived language that I'm speaking right now, as you know yourself, it's often very difficult to adequately encapsulate the full scope of a concept with the limited amount of words that we have to choose from. And then on top of that, the concepts themselves often transcend what the overwhelming majority of people are able to perceive through their limited sensory perception systems. And so then using a word in that contrived language to try to explain something that is beyond sensory perception systems for the majority of people on the planet becomes even more difficult and problematic. And along those lines, one of the words that I've used throughout my videos to attempt to explain the reality of the situation that we are facing in this realm is disconnection. I use the term disconnection because it's the most neutral way to describe the reality of the situation that we're in. And hopefully you can see that this is the very image of disconnection. We are disconnected, cut off from creation in so many different ways. And this image really evokes what I'm talking about when I refer to it as a disconnection, or at least it really encapsulates that disconnection on one very practical and tangible level. Obviously, we could get into this image in a variety of ways, but before going further, I think it's useful to step back a little and gain some perspective on what it is we're looking at. Keep in mind that in the grand scheme of things, in the scale of our evolution as human beings, this is only a very recent phenomenon. I mean, if you think about it, it's only been 200 years, if that, since electricity became very prevalent in what we refer to as society. In many ways, this image has the look of something that is being terraformed. And you don't quite appreciate what I mean by that until you compare it with how the land actually looks in the daytime without all of the artificial country state lines all over the territory. When you look at it like this, you sit there and you say, okay, I see some lakes and mountains and grass and all of the things that we associate with nature. And it all looks like it would have looked 300, 400 years ago. Or at least this is what we assume it would have looked like then, based on the story that we have been told about history. But when you contrast this with the view at night, when you can actually see the electric grid fully functioning, it really looks like this is being terraformed into something different. I mean, credit where it's due, you really sort of have to tip your cap to the intelligence that has been orchestrating all of this from the perspective of viewing it how the land was in its raw state to what it looks like now, not only at night, but during the daytime as well. I mean, in all of these pockets of energy, there exist huge skyscrapers, buildings as far as the eyes can see, roads all over the land. On and on it goes, right? They have built something pretty huge in scale, something larger than what most human minds would theoretically be capable of imagining. And it started off very slow, right? You know, at first there was just some lights in the towns across the country, and it all sort of played into each other. The roads and the electric grid and the buildings all grew together. And especially as it relates to the electric grid, Then you have the telecommunications grid that came into existence with radio waves first, and then television signals, satellites, which led into the internet grids, the broadband connections. I mean, there's cables going across the ocean that started that. And then that bled into the telecommunications industry as far as the wireless system is concerned, where you have the creation of Wi-Fi and the cellular communication networks, and then those eventually merged together in the form of the phones, which are both computers and telecommunication devices, and on and on. The thing is progressing. I mean, that's what I mean by it has the look of being terraformed. What we're looking at now is nothing compared to what it used to be. Imagine how different this was from what we experience now. And of course, along those lines, it's no accident that the agenda going forward, which is openly put out there in all of the official writings that can be obtained by anyone with an internet connection, talking about how the future is in mega city regions, which will be featuring smart cities where everything is connected to the Wi-Fi cellular networks, exchanging data with itself, to the point where even us, the human beings, might join this network by assimilating technology into our flesh. This is their vision of the future, where everyone is conglomerated into these mega city regions that have already been built up. They already have their infrastructure built into place. And then the rural areas will be deserted. This is what all of the Agenda 2030 maps show. I mean, it used to be Agenda 21, right? But now it's 2030, 2050. The original Agenda 21 maps showed these megacity regions with just rural areas that were uninhabited, just wildlife preserves. And that's how the whole climate narrative plays into all this, right? We need to protect these areas, but they, of course, use it for different means. They seize on that sentiment to create something for themselves. That's what all of the climate hysteria is about. And that's tough too, right? Because there is things happening with the climate. It is changing. It's not what it used to be, and there's a variety of reasons for that, but part of it is objectively obvious that yes, the climate is changing, but then they have created this whole different version of that where it's us who is doing it and not larger forces in play, which I want to get to in a second here. And that's how they manipulate us and continue the cycles over and over and over again. But it's just pretty wild, right, to look at something like this and try to take a step back and get some perspective on where we currently are. I mean, this is incredible in scale, what they have created, compared to what it used to be. And in many ways, they've created an electromagnetic canopy through the interaction of all of these electromagnetic fields that are a part of the grid now, as it relates to us and our individual magnetic fields, which are just little specks, grains of sand, as it were, on this image compared to the rest of it. And what I mean by that is, when you take a look at the Earth and its magnetic field, it's very interesting. There is the solar wind, which is coming from the sun and just space in general, or so we're told. And then you have the magnetosphere and the ionosphere. And the solar wind, the magnetosphere, and the ionosphere form a single system driven by the transfer of energy and momentum, where, for example, variations in the solar wind can lead to disruptions of space and other ground-based systems, where the currents are flowing into the ionosphere with increased radiation. In any event, the interaction between the sun's magnetic field and its energy and our magnetic field produces an influence on the ionosphere, and we have a very close and symbiotic relationship with the ionosphere. This was what Schumann originally theorized would exist, are all of the low-frequency electromagnetic waves that oscillate in the cavity between the ionosphere and the surface of the Earth. And there are many different frequencies that he predicted, 7 or 8 that are well known, but the one that we are most familiar with is the 7.83 hertz frequency, which is the one that is the most similar to our brainwave state, the alpha waves. And all of the experiments on circadian rhythm that I kind of got into in the last video and the influence of magnetic fields on our brain waves, what they all show is that we have evolutionarily developed a relationship to that pulse, the heartbeat of the Earth within the ionospheric cavity. And this informs our circadian rhythms and our sleep-wake cycle and just our general well-being. And so the influence of the solar winds and other things happening with the sun and its relationship to the Earth is absorbed by the magnetosphere, the Earth's electromagnetic field. This filters into the ionosphere, which we are connected to on a very deep and fundamental level. And so that influence is transferred into our own state of being individually, our own electromagnetic fields through that interaction. And along those lines, there's a lot of people in the New Age circles that repeat the misinformation that the Schumann resonance is increasing in frequency. And this is not correct fundamentally when you actually look at what the Schumann resonance is. It is low frequency waves that are propagated by the ionospheric cavity between the surface of the Earth and the ionosphere itself. So the only way that the frequency itself could actually rise would be if the Earth expanded and the space between the surface of the Earth and the ionosphere actually increased to increase the waves. Or alternatively, if the magnetosphere collapsed or shrunk in size relative to the surface of the Earth, that would decrease the frequency, or vice versa. I'm not too good with what increases and what decreases the wavelengths, but suffice it to say that one of those two things would have to happen for the frequency itself to actually change. And so it is not correct to state that the Schumann resonance is increasing. It does have its amplitude impacted from time to time, but the amplitude is only impacted in certain situations like I was referring to with the interrelationship between the sun's magnetic field and the Earth's magnetic field. And you can see this influence in all of the research that's been done into sunspot cycle activity and the influence of the sun on our actions as it relates to its own cycles. And just as an example of this that everyone would be familiar with, you can hear about things like this with ER nurses who say that on the full moons, there's more activity, there's more crazy stuff happening. And that's because there's a similar relationship between the Earth and the moon as far as the electromagnetic fields go. And when the moon is full and having a broader impact on the magnetosphere, and that filters down to the ionosphere, it is impacting the behavior of us, the individual electromagnetic fields. And so this is what is happening with the sun and our magnetosphere and how that relates to our general state of being. So what I was saying about how this is sort of a canopy that's been placed over all of us, an electromagnetic canopy, where all of this electromagnetic radiation from the cellular networks and the Wi-Fi networks are sort of polluting our connection to the ionosphere. And this is where a lot of the health problems are stemming from, especially the chronic illnesses and a lot of the things that people just can't place their finger on what is going on with people. Why are people getting so out of sorts? And you can take this to any sort of extreme that you can imagine as far as how this intelligence could use the saturation of this electromagnetic energy to, on its own, influence the general state of being of everyone on the planet, shifting us into different directions. I mean, clearly this is done through the news itself, but it can also be done on an energetic level through the frequencies that are coming out of the computers and the television and the radio and the towers themselves, right? We're just saturated in this technology that it's easy to forget didn't exist 200 years ago. In the terms of evolutionary scale, this situation has existed for the equivalent of, say, a minute of your 24-hour day. That's how long human beings have been exposed to this sort of influence in evolutionary terms. We really have no idea what this is going to do to human beings over the generations. Along those lines, a lot of the times with the scientific studies that are done, where they horrifically use small animals to experiment on, well, these small animals have a shorter lifespan compared to us, and they go through successive generations at a much more rapid pace on their time scale compared to our time scale. So these scientists are able to deduce generational impacts of things like genetically modified food over the generations of these small animals, and they can come to conclusions about how that might impact humans on our scale generationally. And it's no different with the studies that have been conducted on wireless technology and the impact of those electromagnetic fields on our own electromagnetic fields. It's not something that you're going to see in the first generation outside of the impact that it's going to have on those who, for whatever reason, genetically have electrosensitivity. And they're like the canary in the coal mine, where because everyone else is adapting to it as best that they can without seeing anything obvious take place, it's just viewed as this psychosomatic malady that people are subjected to, where it's all in their head that they're being affected by the electromagnetic fields that are saturating all of these electronic grids now. When you see everything connected and lit up at night, and this is just the light grid, right? This isn't showing any of the electromagnetic fields that are connecting all of the wireless grids. And the wireless grids are extending across oceans. You know, if you're right here, you can talk to somebody anywhere on the planet using this little tiny device in your hand. Something that powerful isn't going to have an impact on our own electromagnetic field? Well, of course. But that's the point, is we're not going to see the true impact of all of this for generations. Like, for example, obviously this is just the beginning of what I'm referring to here. Parents blame elementary school cell tower after fourth student diagnosed with cancer. A fourth child has been diagnosed with cancer at a San Joaquin County elementary school, and parents believe it's because of radiation caused by a cell phone tower. The towers are spread throughout the community, but it's this particular one that parents say needs to go. We had a doctor tell us that it's 100% environmental, the kind of tumor that he has. Her son Mason was the second child to be diagnosed with cancer in just 3 years at Weston Elementary. He was 10 years old and walked by this cell phone tower daily. So yeah, this is just the beginning. And when you envision the scenario that's taking place, where there's one of these cell towers on almost every square block of all of these areas, you really get a picture of the problem that is shaping into form here. How we are all being saturated with these electromagnetic fields. In many ways, it's forming a canopy over our heads of electromagnetic pollution that is preventing us from fully tapping into the electromagnetic energy that is being transferred from the sun into the magnetosphere, into the ionosphere, and then into our own brainwaves and our larger electromagnetic body in general. The way that we receive information, I mean, the same way that plants feed themselves through photosynthesis. I mean, that process is taking place with us too. The skin is the largest organ on the body. And then you throw on top of that what's going on in the skies, and you can get an idea about what might be taking place and the countermeasures that are being undertaken to mediate some of what might be going on as far as our own awareness goes and its connection to life, or should I say its attempt to reconnect to creation and life.